Hey, welcome back. Okay, so in the last video we looked at all those paintings by Andrew Wyeth. In this video, what I want to do is lay the characteristic curve over the top of one of those paintings and plug in real values, real exposure values, so you can see how I went about establishing the where the depth of field would be, how color rendition would be, what the contrast would be. So essentially to put together the entire visual style of the show. The important part of what I'm saying here is that when you approach developing a visual style for a project, what you should do is go through this process and lay it all out in terms of dynamic range and the latitude of the camera system that you're using, which is, in effect, laying the characteristic curve over whatever it's going to be, building your visual style on that. But eventually, you don't have to write it all down. It becomes an intuitive part of the way you work, and that's where you want it to be. You want to be able to look at the world, or look at photographs, or look at paintings, or whatever it is, and develop your visual style based on a knowledge of how all those exposures are going to fall on the characteristic curve, and then being able to maintain them shot to shot, scene to scene throughout an entire project. So if you're new to the channel, make sure you click on the subscribe button down below so you get notification when new videos come online. If you like what you see, give us a thumbs up. But right now, let's get to it. Now we've been through all the photographs and talked about the development of the visual style for the Spitfire grill. I want to talk through how I go about laying those values into the camera. Now, it's a two-step process. The first step is taking the values of over and under exposure and plugging them into a theoretical scene from the film. And then the second step is to give it true exposure values. And the reason for plugging in under and over exposure values first is that gives you a good idea of where the values are going to fall on the characteristic curve without having to worry about exposure. And the exposure comes later when you decide where you actually want to put your exposure for the film. Do you want to expose way down low, wide open at 1.3 or 2 or 2.2 or 2.8 to get the shallowest depth of field possible? Or do you need to expose further up to get more depth of field? And you've got to decide where you want to place that exposure value. And you may decide that your true exposure value is based on the actual part of the visual style that you want to achieve. So let's look at plugging in the values, and then secondly we'll look at plugging in exposures. The painting here that I want to look at is the last one we saw in that range of Andrew Wyeth paintings, and the lady sitting in the kitchen. And what I did is I chose this painting as basically my reference key for the entire film. And I based it on film stock, because we shot it on 35mm Fujifilm, as I said earlier. And the stock had a relative latitude of +2, -4. So 2 stops overexposed and it would lose detail in the highlights, 4 stops under, lose it in the shadow. And so what I've done here is plugged in relative values based on the Andrew Wyeth painting. So +2 on the window, which puts it right at the limit of losing detail in the highlights, but still holds on to detail in the mullions. The shadow area above the chair is -4, so just on the verge of losing detail. I put my normal value over there on the stove, -2 down below, lower down on the stove, +5 on the door, +1.5 out the doorway, +0.5 on the lady's back, and -3 under the window. And what that does, it gives me a pretty clear idea of where I'm going to lay those exposures on my characteristic curve. And that's regardless of whether it's film or digital. You do the same thing. The only difference with digital is it would be a little bit broader latitude. So I've laid that in, and now I've got a pretty good idea of how all the values are going to fall within the room. And I use that pretty much as a template for the entire film. So now what I want to do is look at where am I going to put my exposures? Well, I work my exposures around my normal exposure. And I wanted to shoot Spitfire grill pretty much wide open, but giving myself a little bit of room and giving the assistants a little bit of room for focus so that they weren't always right on the hairy edge of being in or out of focus. So I shot pretty much the entire film, or all the interiors and the night exteriors, at around 2.5, 2.8. But let's say for this example, just to make it a little bit easier in numbers, I chose 5.6. And we'll give normal 5.6, and then we just go around the room and we plug in exposure values. And what that does, it now gives me real numbers that I can go and light by. So now I can go ahead and light this scene, and based on my template, I can plug in values, true exposure values, so that I now know where to put the light levels in each of those areas. Now I don't have to worry about the curve, because I know that if I'm at 1.4, I'm 4 stops under. If I'm at normal, I'm 5.6. If I'm 3 stops under, I'm at a T2. If I'm 2 stops over it, I'm at 11. And so then I can start lighting the scene, and as I'm lighting the scene, I can look at it and go, well, I could go a little bit darker in the shadows, or I could go, I need to cut down the window a bit, it's a little bit too bright. The window might measure a +3 and I only need a +2, so I might have to put a neutral density on. The other things I can do is I can play around with the black gammas and extend the shadow detail a little bit more to get a little bit more bite into the shadow. And I could also play with the knee point and the knee slope on the window to get a little bit more detail up there. Essentially, on a digital camera with the broad latitude that we've got now, you're going to have enough overexposure and enough underexposure latitude to pretty much hold everything, but you still do have the flexibility of extending the knee point and knee slope to get more highlight detail, and extending the black gammas to get a little bit more detail down in the shadows. But essentially that's how I go about laying in the values and then laying in the actual exposures. And I do all that in prep, so that before I get on the set, I know exactly where I'm going to start. So I know that my normal exposure for a certain scene, and that may be my key light. My key light's going to be at a 2.8 or a 4 or a 5.6 or whatever I decide. And then I just lay all those other values in, the other true exposure values in, around the theoretical values that I've plugged in as part of my visual style, and laying that POV that I talked about onto the characteristic curve. Now, when you look at all this stuff, it can look very mechanical, and being mechanical is about as far as you could possibly get from what I'm aiming at. Initially, you need to do things a little bit by the numbers until you get practice at it. It's the same as riding a bike, driving a car, or playing tennis, or playing golf, or doing anything that requires repetitive action. You've got to do it over and over and over again until it becomes an intuitive part of you. And then at that point, it just becomes who you are and the way you do things. So it's important to, if you're not familiar with all of this, to go through the process every time you do a shot. Set the shot up, work out what your latitude is, work out where your range of exposures are going to go. And then when you decide on what f-stop you're going to use, you know where all the f-stops are all around the set, so you can walk around with your light meter and simply plug those values in. But now that you've got that done, you can now sit back and look at what you've created and decide, well, it's a little bit too dark over there, or a bit too light, or I need a bit more fill light, or I need a harder edge on the backlight or the kicker, or whatever it is. But then you start to be creative, and then you're really painting. So the more you can practice doing it this way, the easier it's going to become over time, and the more creative and the more interesting your work is going to be. So I hope that gives you a bit of an idea of how you use the characteristic curve and plug in real-world values to start developing a visual style. And as I've said before, this isn't something that I think you need to do every single time. I like to say, well, do it by first principles to start off, and then it becomes an intuitive part of the way you work. And essentially that's how you want it to be. You need it to become an intuitive part of the way you work, so that when you look at the world, or you look at photographs, or you look at artwork, or whatever it is, you see that characteristic curve laid over it, and you know where all those exposure values are going to lay in terms of the dynamic range and the latitude of the system that you're using. So once again, if you are new to the channel, click on the subscribe button down below. If you like what you see, give me a thumbs up. Always happy to receive that, and it just takes a second to click on that button down there. And if you've got any comments or questions, be sure to fire them off in the comments section down below. And I'm always happy to answer questions and respond to any comments. So once again, thanks for watching. See you soon.